Previously on AgentPalmer.com, Amazon Prime's Modern Love is Beautiful, Bob Dylan's memoir Chronicles is poetic, and I'm still honored to have had Jeffrey use his reigning lunatic voice to ask me one last question. This is the Palmer Files, Episode 8, featuring Sean Hizny, where we follow his career from higher education and technical trade to the fine arts of Santa Fe in art galleries and studios, while along the way discussing the importance of art, traditional, fine, and animated. Let's do the show. Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this episode of the podcast is Moving the Needle's own Sean Hizny, here to discuss the finer things in life with me. What's Sean's background? Why is he here? Why is he even qualified to discuss fine art? Sean is here because once I learned that he spent time in galleries and art studios, I wanted to pick his brain about fine art. And well, though we skip over parts of his career trajectory, his job history is pretty interesting as well. Throughout the discussion, we cover his background, and in doing so, we cover his qualifications. Not that they are required of every guest, but for this topic, I wanted to be able to ask him about artists he met and be amazed by his ability to call artists and their work up from thin air, and he did. Of course he did. Now, I'd like to tell you something of Sean and I because we go back a ways. For those of you who are familiar with my Proxycast, which is just a repository of every podcast episode, not my own, I've been on, for those of you who don't know it, which until recently was, every single one, then perhaps it's been so long you've forgotten. But after my first ever podcast appearance on the Stranger Conversations with Grant Markham, which I have discussed a lot on this show and others, because it was the first and, well, because it would lead me directly to my involvement with 7 Days a Geek and eventually the long-lost Season 2 of the Stranger Cons itself, it means that the other early episodes are often forgotten, but not by me. The first time I ever podcasted with Sean was my second ever appearance on a podcast, which was episode 87 of the original feed of Moving the Needle, where we discussed movies we'd seen in the summer of 2015 titled Indominus Cruelty. Since then, it's not like Sean and I recorded that one time and became fast friends. No, he went on doing Moving the Needle until it folded, and I continued on doing my thing until the rebirth of Moving the Needle, where, when it relaunched, Sean was the person in the host seat I knew the least. I knew and had met Henno. I had podcasted previously and tweeted enough nonsense and love of Transformers 86 with Roy, and of course, I live with and love their other co-host, Steph. But all this is to say that when Moving the Needle relaunched, Sean was still very much a stranger to me, but somehow I ended up with his number and we started texting about stuff until I learned about his professional work. Then I held it all to ask with the mics on, because why have a conversation twice when you can have it once and record it? Now, about that one conversation, the one you're about to hear, I had some technical difficulties with my studio that I've cleaned up to the best of my abilities. It's possible you will notice them, but I made sure to mitigate them in such a way that they do not take away from the conversation or the subject at hand. So, without further ado, let's get to the conversation. Sean, you are currently working within the fine arts industry, and you have worked in the fine arts industry, and you even went to school for fine arts. So I figured, who better to discuss fine arts than you? And maybe through this process and through this discussion, the listeners, as well as myself, will gain a greater appreciation for fine art.
Well, let's hope, because it's very important.
Can we start with the greater overall? Like, why is fine art important?
Because it's pretty much the most valued things in many people's lives. If you think of what's the most expensive thing that's ever been sold, it's not a car, it's not a building, it's art. If you think of what gets passed down from generation to generation, I think the things of value are things of fine art most often. I think they have a place in our minds and in our homes that are really not able to be replicated or fit with any other thing necessarily. You can certainly put in a nice print, you can have your own photographs, but I think fine art has a special place in most people's homes. And it varies, there's a lot of different levels of fine art.
This is clearly not the Sean from long ago talking. This is the Sean from now talking, right?
Well, I think I've always held art in a special place. I think it's always been important. I think it always will be important. It's some of the first things put down were drawings.
Where did that come from? Like, I mean, clearly you're not a 2-year-old going like, "Oh, I really like this painting." Like that's not how this works. So, was it your parents? Like, was there influence within your family to appreciate the finer things?
Well, certainly. I mean, my dad was a very creative person. He was a brilliant man, and he was an engineer, but he was also a very gifted artist and a especially great photographer. And my mother was an avid reader and writer, and I think they certainly instilled upon me a value on more than just things, but creating and learning how to translate what you're feeling into what you're, into something tangible. And, even when I was very young, one of the things we'd do on long car rides, this is many moons ago, is just like a drawing game where you draw a scribble and then the next person tries to draw it into something. And I think my parents were always very supportive of pursuits of creative and artistic things. So that's probably where it started at the beginning.
And so you are one of the few people I know in the fine arts industry. Now, I know you went to school and at one point majored in fine arts. The fact that you're in the industry, I don't know if it's because you don't have your degree in fine arts. Like, I don't know if that helps or hurts you because I know a lot of people. I went to school at a very liberal arts college. I knew a lot of fine arts majors, and none of them are in the industry. Like, none of them are doing professional art on any scale. So, what did you originally attend higher education for?
I went to study fine art at a college. I grew up in Massachusetts. It was a college in Massachusetts, and I was given the opportunity to attend on a merit scholarship, not full ride, but close to it. So I signed up. I went. I did not really enjoy it as much as I thought I would. I didn't feel like it was something that was going to give me the tools I wanted for something, down the road. It was hard to envision a career as a painter. So within the first year, I left school to go to a technical school of photography and really focused my efforts on advertising, commercial photography. And getting from there to back into the art world is a long and winding road. So,
all right, is there like a cliff notes of like how many
yes,
jobs?
so many. I mean, I'm going to try to condense it and bring up the most salient points. So after school, as I was graduating, the dean put me and another student forward as potential candidates for a job at an in-house ad agency in Boston. And luckily, my portfolio was the one they were more interested in, so they offered me a job. And it was a very technical job. It was, photographing silverware, flatware, that kind of stuff for ads for like Modern Bride and those kinds of things. If you saw them in the 90s and they were of one of the major silverware companies, it's a chance that I took that photo or at least set it up and did all the lighting. So it was a great job to get straight out of school, and it was probably the only photography job possibly in Boston that actually had healthcare. Photography jobs are highly competitive and usually on a freelance basis or Uh, there's a few other ways in, and I found one that was pretty stable.
In-house for an agency, like, are you shooting something besides silverware, or is there side work, or is this like the main account that they have, so there's just always something to shoot?
Well, the corporation essentially built their own agency and photo studio within their complex, and so it is all of that. It's like catalog photographs, which are oftentimes just the place settings, and in a way that will fit into stuff that they send out. And then there's the editorial style photo shoots where they will advertise in major bridal magazines and places like Town and Country and that kind of stuff, uh, where they will make a full set where you basically are photographing like a family at Thanksgiving dinner, or a opulent wedding. Or
So did you learn how to set a table?
I am quite good, and I will know where just about any fork or utensil should be, according to the gods of etiquette and hospitality.
So you're the guy I want to sit next to, and I'm like, all right, there's like 4 forks here. I do not know. Like, I know in theory.
Yeah, I know where the salad fork goes and the demi-tasse spoon.
You work from the outside in, but if you skip a course, you're screwed. Like, that's where I get confused. Like, when do I go for what and what? But first of all, because I went to an etiquette dinner when I was in college, and I'm gonna not say any names to protect the innocent, but like, I sat at a table with like the dean of students, and I think the academic dean, and all we did was make jokes. Like, in a full etiquette dinner, you're supposed to only pass to the right or to the left or whatever. And one of the deans was sitting on the other side, and the joke was like, well, we don't want the salt to go around the table. Just hand it to me. It's like, but that's against the rules. These kind of things. So I only remember a little bit of etiquette, but I mean, that's got to be important for not only silverware, because you want to sell more than fork, knife, spoon.
Well, you're selling lifestyle and happiness and big events.
So, I don't know if you'll remember this, but what would be the largest place setting you set up? Like a party of what in order to take a photo?
Oh, it was some really big mansion in Cape Cod that we shot on location. It was like a family of, like, not huge. It was maybe 8 people, looking down the table. And the job when you're in, commercial photography is to make it look cinematic and intimate, and also make sure that every single square centimeter of the photo is perfect. And this was at the cusp of the digital world entering in, where things were more easily fixed. But you still need to start with the best, most perfect possible image in perfect perspective. So we still used large field cameras that adjust the plane of the front lens and the where the film is, or the digital back, as it was becoming. And so it was a lot of technical challenges and translating what the designers would sketch out into an actual photograph. And with silverware, it's particularly challenging as it's highly reflective, and earlier digital cameras or backs for cameras were very prone to having purple fringing, and basically color aberrations from metal reflecting on its edge. So it was really quite a technical job, but it really knocks you on your creative instincts as well. You have to solve solutions sometimes creatively in ways that you may not think of right off the bat.
So there's some troubleshooting and problem solving that I'm sure we'll come back to at some point, because I get the feeling that all of these skills kind of build, right? What you learn and what you experience kind of build to where you are. So from photographing silverware, what's the next stop?
Well, the next stop, not too long after that, the the company essentially imploded after they tried to hire some hotshots from Reebok to turn things around, and didn't quite work so awesome. I guess the shoe market and the silverware market don't overlap as much as they had hoped. So I left there and sold cameras for a time, and also was working freelance, and within Boston I was assisting on some other commercial studios. And from there I met my wife. We had a child. For the first 4 years of her life, I stayed home with her. So I was mostly working on weekends and doing weddings and things like that, stuff that I, could do on stuff that was weekend friendly. And I worked for also a real estate company in their marketing department, kind of doing their Photoshop mock-ups and things like that. So that was, covers about 4 years of my life, working on weekends, but staying with my daughter principally over the time. And then from there, we were living in New Hampshire at the time, and I also did some other very odd jobs, like I worked at a casket factory for 10 months. But from there, we moved to Santa Fe, and my daughter was getting to the age where we could put her into daycare and not feel horribly guilty or like terrible failures as parents. So I decided to test the market and found an interesting job as we were driving up, all the way down from New Hampshire to New Mexico. I had applied for a job as a registrar at a gallery in Santa Fe, and surprisingly, they called me back. They liked my background in that I did have some fine art training, essentially, and the interview went smashingly, and that was about 13 years ago, and I've been in fine art since.
Real quick, before we get back to fine art, you found the job during your transit too, but why Santa Fe? Why was that a destination?
Well, for a number of reasons. My then wife's family had moved out there. We had visited several times and just fell in love with the area, the space. It's just this strange place in the desert. It's higher than Denver, and it has a culture that is fascinating. And the art market there is one of the major markets of the entire state. It's the third largest art market in the country, or was at the time. I think it's still right about there.
Up to this point where you start working within fine arts, you've gone to school for it for a time, and you've kept your... I don't want to downgrade you, but it sounds more to me like you're a craftsman as opposed to an artist, with keeping photography as a skill. So I guess first, do you want to challenge me on that? Like, because just the way it sounds to me, I have a big Nikon that it's digital, that I pull out from time to time, and I don't even consider myself to have remotely much skill with it. But it sounds to me like you're a craftsman more than an artist at this point.
Well, I think it's a reductive way of looking at it. I think if you actually work within the art industry, you'll see that most of the successful artists approach it as a craftsman.
Okay.
And you'll find, I think, a lot of the time, successful artists that actually make a living in art are able to do a lot of things and have a kind of varied past. They're not all people that went to art school that just started painting and have painted since and just paint on canvas and don't, ever go from there to anything else. I think it's a fair assessment for me. No, I'm not really working in creating art. I work within the industry. Creatively, the work I've done has been in marketing and advertising and in photography. But I think one of the key attributes you'd see with most successful artists is that they approach it as work. It's something that you don't wait for inspiration for. You work through. I think Chuck Close has some quotes that are valuable in that I think people can get paralyzed by analysis or waiting for inspiration. And I think within that context, you have to appreciate that working is part of getting through something and finding that inspiration. And I think that's valuable for just about any position in or outside of art, is that just working through it.
Well, it's definitely part of the creative process. Like, I can understand that from a technical and creative and productive side of everything I do, right? Like, I'm not necessarily inspired every time I sit down to write a blog post. And I like to think that the editing I do for this show is, you know, it's a process, but I don't sit down every time and I'm like, oh, great, this is going to be fantastic. Sometimes I do, but sometimes but you have to get it done and it becomes work. Now, that doesn't mean I hate the work, but it's still a thing that you have to get through in order to get to the finished product. And the same goes for writing. Now I'm getting reductive and going back on my thing I just said, but like, there are times that you have to get through it. So I understand the work part of artwork, but you're kind of on the periphery and you're not really now at the point. I mean, I'm now jumping ahead in the story. I'll say that. I'm not degrading your photography skills anymore as a craftsman, but you're not painting. You are now a registrar in a gallery. What even is that?
Well, registrars is a lot of things. They are usually responsible for maintaining the inventory, creating a useful database of images, following up with artists, taking the work in, getting all of the details about it, the medium, what it is, what year it was made. It's essentially a record keeper.
Do you get to be critical of the people making the curation decisions? Like, I mean, because clearly registrar is mainly admin. You're kind of at the bottom, but like, do you still get to see everything though? So like, you're not a country bumpkin coming like right off the turn of truck. So like, are you like making this database going like, what are they doing upstairs? Like,
well, it really depends on the gallery you work at. They vary a lot. There are big corporate galleries that cater to and are run largely by bankers. There are more intimate ones run by families or artists themselves. It varies a lot. The gallery that I first started in is one of the top contemporary galleries in Santa Fe, but they were still small and they still had a roster of maybe 20 artists, and they had maybe 5 people at most working at any given time. And it depends on where you are how the role of registrar works. It changes a lot. Like the position that I had and the place that I had, I was largely responsible for maintaining the website, for taking in work, managing the inventory, following up the mailing list, keeping it clean, doing some work on catalogs that we'd print out for upcoming exhibitions. But that's not the registrar everywhere. The registrar at, say a major corporate gallery will just basically be doing record keeping and inventory maintenance. So it varies a lot. And, I was very fortunate to get into where I did when I did, because it was right as they were taking on an artist that has become very, very, very big and successful and a contemporary of some of the bigger artists working today. So I was just kind of at the right place at the right time. I, was able to exhibit, initiative, and, within the context of the art world that I entered, I was able to progress quickly.
Real quick, before we get to your progression, you said it was a small gallery. Now, is it the number of artists? Is it the space? Like, what determines a small gallery?
Well, space, really.
Okay.
Physical space. I mean, there can be, and also the number of artists that you keep and the number of pieces of artists that you keep. While they may have kept technically about 20 artists, they would only ever have maybe between 7 and 10 up at any given time. And during shows, it would be much less. It would be, 2 rooms for the main featured artist during the exhibition, and then 1 room for the other artists that they, have in house.
And is that stuff seasonal? Like, how often does that stuff change?
Well, in Santa Fe, it really is something that happens primarily over summer is when the most action happens. That's when the big shows arrive. That's when the most money is in town. Is from mid-June to the end of August is really the high season.
I'm shocked. I'm literally shocked. Like, I would have expected your high season to be when the snowbirds are in town.
No, they already live here mostly. There are certainly a large influx of Texans that come through town during certain seasons, but in contemporary art, the biggest audience for contemporary art is when the opera is in town. That's in August.
Okay.
There are people that certainly buy other work and more regional stuff and things that we call cowboy art here. They will be here all through the year. That's a flow of art that can work for some galleries. But in contemporary art, it's the summertime is the high season.
Back to you. You move up the ranks, and I mean, is it? I mean, you get to know artists along the way, right? So it's not. I do want to talk about the career trajectory, but on the other side, like, you've gotten to know artists along the way, right? Like, and probably quite a few of them that have come in and out of the various jobs you've done. So is there something that makes one artist, I don't know, better? And I'm not talking about the quality of art. I'm not talking about the end product, which we can all argue over. I'm talking about the artist, the person themselves. Like, is there something that the good ones have in common?
Well, I mean, I think I was touching on it earlier when you were asking about the craftsmanship. I think the thing that a lot of successful artists have in common is they are very methodical in their approach. And there's an important part of it is, staying open. But I think the most important thing is that the artists that are most likely to continue succeeding are the ones that approach it as something that they need to continually work at. And I think it's, from like the perspective when I was a registrar, it would be that their stuff always shows up on time. If we're expecting to get 10 pieces, we get 10 pieces. If we're expecting 30, we get 30. If we're expecting it by the first, it'll be there by the first.
So you mean to tell me that the movies were lying to me? That, like, somebody can't tell a gallery, like, oh, I'll have 10 pieces, and then I only get the inspiration the night before to create 3 masterpieces and show up and just still save the day, even though you're out 7 paintings that I had promised you?
Well, it's a narrative that I certainly take a lot of issue with, and it's not what working in a gallery is really like. It may be for some galleries, but I've worked at some high level as well as some mid level galleries, and I have not seen anything quite like what you will see in the movies. And I think there's definitely a conversation to be had too about the narrative of tortured genius and inspired brilliance. I think it's largely apocryphal, and I think a lot of times it really gives a poor message of art and creativity in general. I think the notion of the tortured, effortlessly brilliant artist is largely unhelpful to anyone that would be interested in getting into the art world.
Have you met anyone close to the genius who puts no effort into it? It's just like sprays from his fingertips.
Well, sure, that exists. There are
Okay.
people that start off with a bigger head start than others, I think is a better way of looking at it. There are some people that do just have an ability to tap into a creative element that other people will work harder at and may never even come close to. There is some truth into the narrative of a brilliant artist, for sure. And there is a correlation between mental illness and some brilliant artists. But I think it's a pretty lousy narrative that is way too celebrated. And I think it in general is harmful to first of all, anyone suffering from mental illness that doesn't paint like you know, a
That's fair. That's
brilliant
fair. You have this
artist.
illness. Here's a
Yeah,
paintbrush.
therefore you should be creative. Therefore you should be able to write Gravity's Rainbow, or create Guernica, or be Van Gogh. I think people that don't have it's something that I think that coexists, but I don't think that to be, say, Van Gogh, you don't have to suffer from horrible mental illness in a time where it's largely misunderstood. And I think if you ask a lot, now I know.
Wait,
artists,
are you talking about now? Because I mean, mental illness is still fairly misunderstood.
Oh, it is. But I think if you ask people now that have some better understanding, if they would rather, if they're like kind of grateful for their mental illness because it helps their creativity, I think almost none of them would say yes. None of the ones I know would trade their mental illness for creativity, or basically sacrifice their mental health for creative inspiration. I think a lot of them would say I'd much rather never touch a paintbrush again if I could not feel that. And I think it's just, I think, a harmful story that I think is tired and repeated way too often, and I deride it. I think in large part it's unhelpful, and it's unfortunate because one of the things that's sexy about art, and as a writer, I'm sure you can relate, the notion of the brilliant tortured souls is in almost every industry. If you think of the great writers, oftentimes they have these terrible pasts or tortured minds, and it's a notion that I have trouble with kind of getting behind, because it's in art. It also is part of the narrative that sells the story. Sometimes the curators or the gallery directors fall in love with someone's story, and it's oftentimes, I think, not. I mean, I think it's never more important than the art, but the story is oftentimes what can help sell the work.
All right, let's get back to your story, because I think a lot of the knowledge that you've just dropped on us, whether it comes from experience or just emotion or passion, comes from having been around the industry. I didn't even know some of these were things because I'm not around the industry. Like I've been to my local art museum. I've been to a few local galleries. I know personally one actual artist. I guess two. I know a potter and a painter. But like on such a small scale, none of these issues ever really come up. So from a local perspective, most people probably only have my experience, right? A small local art museum and maybe one or two galleries. I'm getting off topic. I want to get back to you before I go on this, but let's go down this road for a second. What is there beyond art museum and local galleries are? Like, what can someone do besides traveling to New York and San Francisco and seeing the big museums? Tristan talked about archaeology Twitter. Is there an art Twitter? Like, is that a thing?
There's online galleries that you can find where you'll find that there's increasing amounts of artists going on there, and there's galleries participating more within them. You can look them up. I mean, the Artsy's probably one of the biggest. Saatchi online is another pretty big one. But there are online marketplaces of art where you can expose yourself to, and they're open to a pretty wide audience. I think that's somewhere you could kind of start with a jump off. One of the places that used to exist was Tumblr, was one of the big places for artists to put their portfolios, put their work out there. It was a great place for a while. Then it was bought by Yahoo. Then it was bought by Verizon. And now just about no one uses it. Pretty much when they took porn off, a lot of people stopped caring about them. And the audience shrunk. And I think a lot less creative people were interested in it.
So they didn't go anywhere? Like, there wasn't this mass migration to some other platform? They just kind of went, all right, well, I'm going to stick
scattered. Like, they went to Pinterest and like DeviantArt, and there's just lots of landing spaces, but there's not really a central repository. There's there's places on Reddit where you can follow, artists aspiring and other levels that are trying to put their stuff out there. But I don't think there's really one space that they all kind of congregate to for a kind of for a visual blog experience. I'd say Pinterest is probably the closest, but again, with Pinterest, you can easily just get locked into an echo chamber of art taste that will all kind of follow through, and that's one of the issues with following anywhere that aggregates or uses AI or tries to find the other things you may like, is oftentimes it's just going to be a lot of similar things. And I think the bigger value is finding even local galleries are going to give you a little more of a rich experience, I think, oftentimes. And you don't really experience art through a screen the same way you do in person.
Let's get back to you're moving up the chain. And I mean, I guess at this point I get to ask, how high did you go?
Well, I mean, I got to the level of being just about the director of a pretty successful gallery in Santa Fe. And, within the first gallery I started in, within the first year, I went to Art Basel for the full show, and we were in 2 exhibitions there, and, handled all of that stuff. And that's, arguably the biggest art show in the country. And it was a great experience. I was very fortunate. And again, I think timing played a large role in it. And I think it was just a great time to be in Santa Fe and working in art. And so then from there, I eventually got burned out of being at that gallery. The more responsibility you get, the longer hours you spend, the more of a job it really becomes. It's a lot less glamorous when you're dealing with all of the wrangling lots of people, essentially herding cats, and it wears on you after a while. So I moved on to another gallery that was also very big and very successful, but it was a little more removed from the high contemporary art realm. It was more of like I don't know, I don't want to call it a Walmart, but it was certainly more commercially viable work, more, I mean, one of the things you say in the art world when you're trying not to be insulting is decorative work, but work that fits with people's couches more than is important. So I sold that for a while.
It begs the question, right? Like, what's the level of consumerism in the art world? Because I know creating a digital print is no longer the arduous task that it used to be. You can do that. You can have a gallery and just walk out with a poster. Sure, it's not the same. It doesn't have quite the same depth, but I can still hang that on my wall.
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with limited edition, prints. They're still valuable. They will still gain value, but they are still expensive. They're not posters, they're not mass produced. The artist I work for currently, we offer limited edition prints, but they're very expensive. They're, up to $1,000, and they are in many ways indistinguishable from the originals. Unless you got close enough to see whether or not there was pastel dust, you would not know the difference. And they are beautiful, and they are just, works of value of art. You can certainly in digital reproduce in mass, and I think that there's a place for that, and there's nothing wrong with getting a poster of the work. Most people can't afford a lot of artwork. Oil paintings are expensive. Even the cheap ones are more expensive than most people can just afford as a indulgence.
I mean, I guess you joke about the consumerism of, things that go with my couch, but is that the entry point for most people? I'm guessing. I don't know. Like legit just guessing here, but like, is that the entry level for like, I have a piece of art on my wall?
It really varies. There's not a prototypical collector. There are collectors that have, saved for years to buy a certain artist's work, and they'll buy the most affordable thing of theirs they can acquire, that they have a attraction or they're compelled towards. But I mean, I think the idea of a collector being a certain way or entering in a certain spot is largely not that common. There are some things that are maybe a little more common. The first thing a collector usually buys isn't a large tapestry or a monumental sized painting or something like that. They usually will buy something small first. But that small thing, depending on the artist, can cost, $500 or $50,000. and I've seen both happen. And it's just, there's just not a one size fits all thing. It just varies a lot. Oftentimes the first thing they buy is something on the smaller scale, but it really runs the gamut.
So that's fair, because I'm thinking about my own history, right? So I'm going to discount any of the art that my parents had that I either ended up with because it was hanging in my, I liked it enough that I wanted to hang it in my room. There's an astronaut piece in my living room that's, about 3x2, 3.5 by something. I mean, it's fairly large, right? And then, but I won't count that because I didn't buy that. I picked that out of a collection that I had access to, being my parents. The first piece I ever picked out, that it was purchased for me, so I can't actually tell you cost, was about this. It was a piece when I was in overseas in Jerusalem of a student sitting with a rabbi with a globe illuminating the room, like a floating globe illuminating the room. And I'm doing this from memory, by the way. Like, that's also in my living room, but like, honestly, probably it's been a couple months since I've like actually looked at that piece. But that one, which I picked out myself, probably the size of a piece of paper, probably 8.5 by 11. Like, it's not that size, but it's about that size.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a standard? Like, I mean, I'm asking you to do the impossible, but like, is that along the smaller side that we're talking about? Like, about the size of a piece of paper? Kinda?
Yeah, something around between, say, 8 by 10 and 16 by 20 is what I'd consider a small work, and that's oftentimes the first thing someone acquires. It's not always, but I found it more often than not. The first thing someone buys is something on the smaller end.
Because then the next thing I end up getting is then I get into a different kind of art, which is animation cels, like original animation cels, where I've got animation sketches in my living room, and I've got animation cels in my office, and that's where my art gets really contemporary, I guess, because it was from another form of media that is basically extinct now. Nobody's using hand-drawn animation cels anymore.
Sure, and I think that's an important thing. Is we shouldn't really. I don't think the line between fine art and commercial art or digital art is really all that valuable to draw. I think, pun intended. But
no, I like it because what it means is that this is still art on my wall. Like, you're not going to come over and be like, what are you doing?
No, I think that's something I often worry about, is the notion of people feeling intimidated by contemporary art or fine art, high art, whatever you want to call it. It's a moving target, and it's in flux all the time. And there was a time when acrylic paint was considered not high fine art, or photography was not high fine art, or color photography definitely wasn't. But it's a moving target, and it's always changing. And I think the people that tell you otherwise or explain why something isn't good are people you don't really want to be listening to anyways.
Is digital now the new, like, is that the new color photography? Is digital?
It's currently the redheaded stepchild of the art world, I'd say, but it's only a matter of time before that changes. And just like, 3D printing or something else that will come along. Digital art, the knock on it is the same knock on photography, where it's infinitely reproducible without degradation of quality. It's only available in, a printed form or through a screen. Therefore, it is less. But I mean, I think it's just a argument that I just don't really feel is worth much time, because I think it's like, with you and with words, language is always on the move as well. It's constantly in flux. It is something that moves at a fast speed, and what may be grammatically correct at one point in time, or a word like unique, will lose its fine definition over time. I think art is largely the same way, and they're both art. But I think the idea of what's best, better, highest quality, most intellectually legitimate is something that will constantly change.
Well, I think one of the arguments about highly reproducible gets to the intent of the art. I feel like this is where it's one of those, I'm writing this post because I want to review this book and tell the world that I really liked this book. Or I'm writing this post because, I really like this, or I really like that, or I'm drawing this picture because it's in me and I want to draw it, or I'm writing this poem because I have words I want to convey. And that's all fine and dandy. But if I want to draw this picture to sell 1,000 copies of it, I think that's where people end up having an issue with how reproducible things are, because there can be an intent to sell or sell out, I guess, that the traditional world has a bit of a problem with. Like, I would too, though. Like, I have an issue with clickbait. I can't imagine it would be any different for somebody who just was like, I'm going to take that picture because I can sell it.
Sure. And I don't, I certainly don't mean to assert that I'm on the vanguard of anything here, but I think the thing that happens often, if you look through the history of art and media, is the means of production oftentimes become part of the value added to it. And I think that if you look at, reproducible art in its earlier iterations, if it was like a lithograph or a silk screen, it was something that still had an element of the artist involved, or at least oversight by them. And I think you'll find something like that will happen eventually with digital art, where it'll be like, well, it's, produced on a machine that was calibrated by the artist. It will be something like that. And I think the idea, like with writing too, writing, words, and your blog, can be copy and pasted anywhere, but it's still your words. And certainly that someone can change it around just enough to, call it their own. But I think that the value is in the artist, and not necessarily the exact product or some facsimile thereof of.
Well, and I like that, because that gives me hope in the way that, photographers play with shutter speed, right? Like, the tool becomes more of the art, right? So now the film is no longer just the blank canvas. It's also another brush, right? I mean, I guess that's a very rough metaphor, but it works, and every keystroke or the coding or the calibrating of the machine becomes a part of the process through which the artist can express themselves. So I like it, but it kind of leads me to like this one question I wanted to ask you that I feel like we have established you are qualified to answer, which is how does fine art compete? And I feel like it's compete because we're in an era where everything's to win. But how does it compete with Netflix? How does it compete with the new medias of, moving pictures? Because nobody even really talks about music as art as much anymore. And we usually only hear about films that are art house films that like were made for $50 on a handheld camera and released in 2 theaters. Like, how does that compete with the world of fine art?
Well, they're just they're just not the same thing. It's just you're referencing, there is something to really the things you consume on Netflix are created by cinematographers, set designers, computer graphic artists. They're assembled and built by artists. So in one way, you're really it's really just moving the station a little bit. It's moving it a certain way. Now, if you're asking like fine art paintings, how do they compete? Well, I think the way that they compete, if that's the context of it, is that there really is nothing like seeing a multi-layered oil painting in person right now. Eventually, there will be high enough definition renditions, and our screens will be so beautiful and so precise and pristine that it will feel like you're standing right in front of the painting. That will happen eventually. But the experience of seeing something in a museum or a gallery is currently a special experience, and it offers something that I think is not reproducible through a screen on you consume through Netflix, where you're looking at a backlit screen that's got these colors boosted to crazy levels, and you don't get the sense of scale of art either, or what it feels like to walk around a sculpture. And sure, there will be plenty of galleries that will create walkthroughs that will give you a sense of it, but it's still not the same thing, at least yet. And it's the difference between looking at something in 3 dimensions and looking at it on a 2-dimensional surface. And again, VR is coming around. I mean, hell, even Marina Abramovich, one of the biggest artists in the world, is just on the cusp of selling one of her, this unique experience that is going to be through virtual reality headsets. So art will move around it, but also the more traditional fine art experience is still something that's special. And, I found like when I was in my early teens and went to the Museum of Modern Art, and before I had gone there, I had certainly experienced a Van Gogh and a Dali and all these other artists on paper, and it's nothing like when you really see it. Like the Dali, Persistence of Memory is an entirely different experience in person, and we still aren't there yet where you can experience it through a screen in the same way. I think that's something that is why they will still be museums for a long time, because it's just an experience, and you're also putting yourself into a space to experience it, and it takes a deliberate effort to do it.
Now, you are talking about museums, so the listener that is listening to this episode right now has a free afternoon and they can go to one place. Do they go to the local art museum or do they find a gallery? Like, this is going to be their first foyer into the world of fine art. Do you have a suggestion for one versus the other, or it doesn't matter?
No, it matters, and there's a difference. I think going through a museum is a different experience. It is oftentimes the level of art is, going to be higher. They typically have resources that are much higher. They have access to collections that, a gallery wouldn't have. Galleries are trying to sell the work. Depending on where you are, if you're in a place that tends to attract tourists, you may find the level of art is meant for people looking for something that's a little more on the decorative end, maybe not on the idea of something that challenges you or is an experience in person. It's something that they might want you to think about taking and putting in your backpack or in your luggage, something that you might want for your house that'll be on the more decorative side. Museums certainly have less of a motivation to have the most popular things, but they also have them. I mean, you can find all sorts of art critics that slam museums for putting out more of the big names rather than, people that are considered doing more interesting things, because attendance matters to museums too. But galleries, I think, will give you a much wider swath of art in your region at the very least. I think it's opens it up a little more to getting something that you haven't seen before, and you will certainly not know most of the artists you see there. In a museum, you're more likely to see an artist that's names you recognize, that maybe even a piece that you know is famous. And I think galleries don't have the same gatekeepers and curators, involved. They curate it themselves, and the work they put on their walls is stuff that they uh, you know believe in some way. And museums have other issues, and they have big boards, and they have people with their own biases and prejudices, and there tends to be a watering down effect with some of that. I mean, hell, even the Museum of Modern Art recently, they upped their diversity to have 7% of their hanging work as women. And you know that's something you can certainly have your opinions about that, but I mean, I think most people would see that as a pretty limited scope. And these are some of the biggest, most important minds in art, and they still have only gotten to 7% representation of women.
And I'll say that the other thing that is probably unique to galleries on a everyday level is you're more likely to run into an artist on display. It's probably very rare you're going to walk into a museum and the artist will be there. But if you walk into a gallery, there's a very good chance an artist is there. And listen, they all have stories and they're all willing to talk to you. At least for the artists I've known and that I've met in galleries, they're not always looking to make a sale. Like, I know there are probably people listening to this that are like, yeah, but if I talk to him or if I compliment him on the piece, like, some of them just, it's kind of, I'm going to make this about podcasting because it makes it more poignant to the fact that the person who's listening right now is listening to a podcast. But sometimes it's just about feedback. I can launch a Patreon. I can launch a support me button. But if you like the show, just tell me you like the show. If Sean was a shit guest, he wasn't, by the way, at least my opinion, but just tell me. Let me know. If I missed a question, let me know. Like, sometimes the feedback is just as important. And people like hearing your thoughts. And it can be your first time in a gallery. It doesn't mean you can't have an opinion on the painting that you're looking at.
No, absolutely.
Or the photograph.
And that's the thing that I just bristle at, is the notion that fine art is for someone else, or is just this area that you just don't tread because you're just not equipped for it. And there certainly is a big elitism problem within contemporary fine art, but I think the days are numbered for that kind of haughtiness. And I think that the best way to start combating against it is just get out there and put yourself out there. And if you find an artist that you really love, like at a gallery or a museum, and they're still alive, you'd be surprised how often artists are completely normal, nice, outgoing people that will respond to an email. It's remarkable how much you can find out by just, trying and putting yourself out there a little bit. When I was in the photography school, one of the assignments we had was to reach out to a famous photographer and ask them about a photograph they took. And half the people didn't even do it because they just didn't want to try to reach out to like an Annie Leibovitz or, a Meyerowitz or whoever. But I did it, and I reached out to one of my favorite National Geographic photographers, and he not only, responded, he called back, and we had like a 45-minute conversation about his experience photographing a certain set that I had asked him about. And I think you'll find yourself pleasantly surprised putting yourself out there and approaching artists. And again, there's this whole idea of artists being unattainably in another realm or in their own head in some way. And oftentimes the artists, even highly successful, amazingly accomplished artists, are incredibly well balanced, have fully functional families, and none of them are going to write books about them at the end, or if they are, they're going to be loving memoirs and not running with scissors or something like that.
Yeah, I will say, the other part of it is you're not interrupting them. I feel like the one thing, at least for me, the one thing Hollywood gets right is you can be in a zone, quote unquote. If I'm, in the middle of writing a post that's flowing, don't interrupt me. And if a painter's, in the flow of creating something, don't interrupt them. But guess what? If they're standing at a gallery, or they're just walking around, you're not going to interrupt them. They're not going to snap at you because they're just not. They're down-to-earth people. And interrupting a process, yes, absolutely. If there's somebody at a blank canvas that's putting brushes on, maybe take a moment.
Well, actually, in Santa Fe, usually over the summer, there's a event called a paint out where most of the galleries have some artist from their gallery out painting in plein air, which means in plein air. And that's an opportunity where you can see some of the painting happening. And trust me, I've set up the paint outs in some galleries, and they only put out artists that are going to be approachable and relatively friendly. And if you're in a space where someone is working in some creative fashion, oftentimes if you're in that space, they are approachable. If they did not want to be bothered, they would not be. You would not be in there. But that's not that's not always the case. But I think it's often the case.
So we've covered most of your story. We've covered fine art being approachable. Look, I want to say something before the end of this, which is there is something to be said for owning a piece of art and knowing that you chose this piece out of all of the other ones, whether it was in the 50 galleries you walked into or the first one, like you chose, this is your piece. It is a personal choice. It is a selection, and you shouldn't be intimidated. The only thing that should be intimidating about art is the price. And in most galleries, you will find things, especially local galleries, in non-huge metropolitan areas. Like I live in a secondary metropolitan area. So like my galleries have art within $20 to $120 most of the time. That's that smaller 8 by 12, 20 by 32, within that smaller range, you'll be able to walk out with a piece for less than a Benjamin. You don't need to start out thinking about it as an investment. Think about it as something that will enrich your home and your life.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to approach it. I just think it's important not to feel intimidated, as you were saying, and I think it's important to not feel limited, that the artwork that you love may not be an oil on linen painting. It may not be a sculpture that, is from a foundry. It may not be, something that you'd consider necessarily a piece that would be an investment. But there are, if you love animation sells. It's art and it's yours, and it's a piece and a place and time. It's of value to you is the most important part of it. And it is something, as I said at the beginning, I think that one of the greatest values of art is that people truly value it and pass it down, and it should mean something to you. I mean, you can buy a Live, Laugh, Love wood stencil anywhere, but I mean, a piece of original art is something that, speaks not only to, the artist, but also to a time and a place where that thing resonated with you. And that experience is in large part what art's about. And I think it's a valuable thing. And I think it's something that people should put themselves out and try to experience more and involve themselves with it in some capacity. And as you said, there's really not just a level of fine art. There's lots of layers. And I think it's something that you should really, really do or buy.
It can sound like I turned and did a 180 at the end there because Sean and I line up so well in our own minds on why art is important and getting into collecting it and appreciating it. But that's the way it was all along. I just got to have some fun playing devil's advocate because I didn't want the entire episode to be an echo chamber. Fine art is important, just like music and moving pictures are important. And while Sean's podcast is more about pop culture than anything else, the question that starts moving the needle, what's moving you, is a relevant question, not for others to ask you, but for you to ask you, especially when it comes to art, any kind of art. Find the thing that moves you and go after it. Can't afford an original? Get a print. There are plenty of ways to appreciate, experience, and collect the things that move you. This is greater than art in terms of what its validity is. This could go for anything really, but what's most important is that you have some connection to it. And what we say at the end is probably the most important thing, and thus, I'll reiterate, fine art is not for the uber-rich to appreciate. Sure, they can afford to collect pieces that most other people can't, but the appreciation isn't guarded by a price or surrounded by a wall of exclusion. Art is all around us, and affordability is only important as far as collecting original pieces. Getting prints or just being somewhere and taking in the sights, that's literally why we call things priceless. Because while there may be a required or requested donation to get into a local museum, or while you may feel obligated to buy something from your local gallery, even if it's just a cup of coffee, you're not priced out of going in and getting the experience of looking at the pieces hanging on the walls or in the display cases. So, do you have a favorite local gallery or museum? Have we inspired you to go out and find one? Do you already have a collection hanging on your walls? Tweet or email the show and let me know. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, Episode 8. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for some official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. Let me know what you think. You can tweet the podcast at The Palmer Files, myself at Agent Palmer, and you can reach this week's guest, Sean, at S.J. Hizny. That's S.J. Hizny, and you can tweet his show at MTNPod. That's MTNPOD. The show email is thepalmerfiles@gmail.com, and don't forget the Moving the Needle podcast, where you can listen to Sean exactly where you are listening to this episode right now, and you can see what else I've got going on at agentpalmer.com. You can also hear more of me in the meantime on Our Liner Notes, a musical conversation podcast with host Chris Meyer, and my new gig as co-host of the Podcast Digest with Dan Lizette. Sean, so do you have one final question for me?
Sure. Who is your favorite artist?
Wow.
Well, favorite isn't the fair way of putting it. Who is
you
an
could say
artist?
Favorite.
Who is an artist that has resonated with you deeply? Because favorite is like your favorite movie, and that can change based on the time of day.
I will say that I think it's my collection of animation cells and animation sketches that's kind of there with it, and that's Ralph Bakshi, because not only do I enjoy the pieces, but I enjoy the story and the collection of everything else that went along with it. Plus, it's not art in a singular, it's art in a web. So from, I'll take one of Bakshi's seminal films, Wizards, and in Wizards, there are these still histories that they will shoot to and pan around. And most of those histories were illustrated by Mike Ploog. And Mike Ploog is somebody whose art popped up on me later in life when I've been a Magic player playing Magic the Gathering since basically it maybe 2 years into its start. It started in 93. I started in 95. And I don't know. I kind of just on a whim Googled Mike Plug, and it came up that he did art for Magic. And I've always appreciated the art in Magic cards. And I knew some of the original artists, but like it never occurred to me that like there would be an overlap. And for the next, I want to say, after I did this Google search, which was a couple years ago, not many, but a couple years ago, I basically went down a rabbit hole of like, all right, well, I'm just going to do a search and I'm going to collect every Mike Plug card art, because even at the most expensive, that it didn't appear to be much. And the collecting is almost as fun as the research. So I did that. And then I found out that Ian Miller, who did some of the backgrounds on Wizards, also did some Magic cards. So I went down and I collected a bunch of those. Like, it just became a thing. But Bakshi was like the central artist to everything. And then a few years ago when he did Last Days of Coney Island, and, you know, I was watching him kind of get back into animation because they were kind of showing a lot of the behind the scenes and the making of. It was a completely different style for him, but he's changed. You know, he retired and went to the desert out by you. And I can appreciate that change in so many different ways now that, like, I feel like Ralph Bakshi would probably be like the one artist who's my favorite.